Most Americans never learned that before D-Day, before the Ruhr was crossed, and before Berlin fell, a handful of U.S. intelligence officers were already on the ground in one of the most unstable, violent, and opaque corners of Axis-occupied Europe. In November 1943, while Yugoslavia was still a layered civil war under German occupation, the Office of Strategic Services parachuted a small team into Bosnia, not to fight with rifles, but to purchase risk, ambiguity, and betrayal with gold, radios, and signatures on thin paper. Their orders were brutally simple: find Tito's partisans, open channels for coordinated sabotage of German rail and river traffic that fed the Eastern Front, and get out alive. None of these directives would remain intact for long. The drop occurred at night above hills south of Travnik. For Americans, one British Link officer and two shepherds, recruited from Balkan emigres, floated down through freezing air with T-5 parachutes and kit bundles that thudded into wet ground like coffins without lids. The wind scattered them across terraces of rock and thin soil. One crate, the crate with reserve batteries and part of the cipher pads, was lost down a ravine before it was even touched by a human hand. From the first hour, the mission bled leverage. Without redundant power, every watt transmitted would also be a wager. Signal too often and German direction finding triangulates you. Signal too little and Washington assumes you're dead. They hiked in blackout discipline for 3 days toward a partisan way station that London had been told was sympathetic. When they arrived, they found a barn burned to its stones and its wells poisoned with dead livestock. Luftwaffe retribution for an earlier sabotage they had known nothing about. Cold stripped motion first, then judgment. No one on the team, not even the British officer who had worked Balkans before the war, could yet map the real front lines. Because the front lines did not exist in lines. They existed in rooms, in deals, and who fed whom that week. The Americans were trained for codes, demolitions, and reporting. They were not trained for a battle space where yesterday's ally might sell you at dawn for a sack of flour. In one of the few pages preserved from the team leader's diary, a sentence sits like a thesis of a regular war. Gold buys bread, trust buys dawn. He wrote it after a village elder demanded British gold sovereigns up front merely to send a runner toward Tito's district headquarters, not to guide, not to protect, just to inquire. The OSS colonel in Bari who had approved this concept mission had warned on paper in austere prose, human terrain is more fluid than map terrain. Time and trust price upward under fire. He was not exaggerating. Here in Bosnia, prices were exponential. Anyone who has tried to buy alignment in fragile states a lifetime later, from Helmand to Mosul to Kivu, will recognize the core continuity. You can purchase motion, never conviction. Entropy compounds on credit. In war and in money, the first loss is often the cheapest. Refusing to book it early can make the final loss absolute. By the second week, the Americans were finally in a partisan hut with a roof and a fire. They had a call sign, a crude sketch of German rail notes, and one working radio. What they no longer had was the illusion that they understood who in Yugoslavia would keep them alive for reasons other than price. When they keyed their first outbound burst to Bari, the set pulsed, stuttered, and died. It would not power again until parts were scavenged or stolen. Somewhere between that Black Valley and Rome, a new line entered their ledger: radio silence. Unexplained, persistent, and lethal to trust upstream. Gold was supposed to be their salvation. Instead, it became their curse. By December 1943, the OSS detachment, codenamed Ranger, had become walking treasuries. Each man carried a pouch of British gold sovereigns stitched beneath his uniform lining, intended for bribes, supplies, and the occasional life-saving favor. But in Yugoslavia, every faction had learned to weigh friendship by the ounce. To the Chetniks, the gold represented an American attempt to tilt loyalties toward Tito's communists. To Tito's men, it was a symbol of British hesitation, a reminder that London trusted currency more than conviction. The terrain around Jace was unforgiving: steep ridges, shifting snow, and villages that had learned the art of neutrality through silence. The team's only advantage was mobility, and even that vanished when the Germans launched Operation Kugelblitz, a massive anti-partisan sweep in early December. Villages that once offered bread now demanded payment just to point a direction. Every handshake was a transaction. Lieutenant David H. Moore, the OSS radio officer, noted in his journal, "Every word costs us something now. A yes costs gold. A no costs time. Both can kill us. By mid-month, the team managed to re-establish contact with partisan forces under a local commander known as VO. He was young, confident, and well-connected with Tito's 2nd Proletarian Brigade, but he wanted proof of American sincerity, ammunition, medicine, and at least a dozen sovereigns to compensate his scouts. The Americans obliged. Within days, the partisan guides vanished with both gold and the promised supplies. No one in the nearby villages had seen them. Or so they said. A fragment from an OSS field memo later summarized the situation with clinical detachment. In Yugoslavia, trust is a currency with no fixed exchange rate. The agents began to realize that their mission, linking Allied intelligence to a coherent resistance, was not merely tactical. It was economic. They were fighting a war against scarcity as much as ideology. Every transaction carried moral interest. The more they spent to buy cooperation, the less credible their mission appeared. In the decades since, historians have described the Yugoslav front as the marketplace of allegiance. It was the first theater where Western intelligence truly confronted the idea that financial aid could destabilize as much as it could empower. What the OSS learned in those frozen valleys would later shape the doctrines of Cold War covert action, from Tehran to Saigon. Money can build bridges, but it cannot guarantee who crosses them, or why. Wealth, in any form, invites calculation, and calculation rarely aligns with conviction. On December 21st, the team dispatched a young courier named Petar with coded messages for Tito's headquarters, confirmation of their position, supply requests, and an urgent plea for exfiltration guidance. Petar had been with them for 2 weeks, quiet, efficient, and seemingly loyal. He left at dawn under a rising snowstorm, carrying the sealed pouches and the gold payment for Tito's liaison. He never arrived. When spring came, local peasants claimed to have found scraps of American parachute silk in a ravine north of Jace. The courier's trail ended there, along with their last known cipher pads. And for the men of Ranger, one question began to grow louder than the wind that howled through the Bosnian passes. Who exactly were they paying to protect them? The first hint that Ranger had been compromised did not come from a gunshot, a capture, or a confession. It came from the enemy listening better than their allies. In January 1944, decrypted fragments from German Army Group E and SS intelligence traffic suggested that American parachutists had been reported within the partisan zone. The Germans did not know grid or head count, but they knew enough to tighten a noose. That meant someone had been paid twice, once by the OSS for silence and once by the Axis for disclosure. The suspicion detonated inward. The Americans could not know whether the leak came from a Chetnik broker, a partisan commissar, a starving villager, or the vanished courier Petar himself. The hills around Bugono became an echo chamber of doubt. The team began to notice things that now felt like signals: a door that opened too fast when they passed, a boy who stared too long at their boots, a partisan guard who no longer made eye contact when taking bread. On the 12th day of radio silence, Moore finally coaxed their set to life using scavenged copper and bits of tractor wire. He tapped a short burst to Bari, position, degraded strength, and a single chilling line, suspect informant within contact chain. Before a reply returned, the set died again, this time not from failure, but from force. Someone had entered the barn while the men slept and smashed the crystal housing with a rifle butt. In a post-war British memorandum on Yugoslavia, one sentence reads almost like a eulogy for the mission. You may purchase action. You cannot purchase alignment. The OSS team was now trapped inside a paradox of their own design. The use of gold to generate access had also created incentives to betray them for profit. Anyone who followed counterinsurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan will recognize the pattern. Pay for cooperation, and you often fund the very networks that later sell you to the opposition. Cash is not neutral in war. It compounds instability when identity is already fractured. If you must buy loyalty, you do not own it, you rent it at a rate set by your rivals. Night watches doubled. Sidearms were kept unholstered indoors. The team began to move in pairs, even to the latrine. No one trusted anyone outside the original drop party, and some no longer trusted all of them. When a partisan liaison arrived 3 days later with instructions purporting to be from Tito, the Americans did not know whether they had just received salvation or an escort to a pre-agreed handover. They packed anyway. By February 1944, the team made a decision few covert units survive. They split. In a bar near Gornji Vakov, after a night of whispered argument lit only by a candle cup and steam from wet wool coats, they divided into 2 cells. Cell A, 2 Americans and the British link officer, would attempt to push south and west toward the Adriatic in hopes of reaching an exfil corridor through partisan-held Herzegovina. Cell B, the remaining Americans and their last reliable local guide, would stay behind to maintain any threat of contact with Tito's headquarters, if such a threat still existed. To move was to risk contact with German JAG commandos. To stay was to risk slow encirclement by information leaks. Snow made every footfall audible, every footprint traceable. The Adriatic-bound cell stripped gear to the bone. Each man carried a carbine, minimal rations, one medical roll, and his sovereigns. Anything heavy stay behind. In the high country east of Prozor, they passed 3 villages that refused them entry, not with rifles, but with closed doors and dark windows, a silent veto born of terror. The stay-behind cell fared no better. Without the radio, their mission was not truly communication, but merely not vanishing yet. They traded gold for flour, but flour came thin and late. They offered sewing needles, quinine, and razor blades for information, but most information came as shrugs. In Bosnia that winter, hunger outranked politics. A British colonel who later reconstructed this phase wrote, "Concentration maximizes effect. Division maximizes entropy." The Americans chose entropy, not from ignorance but from arithmetic. A single capture could erase the mission. A split at least preserve a chance that one half might surface alive. Modern crisis managers would recognize the pattern. When information collapses and risk is asymmetric, organizations fracture to survive variance. Cohesion is a peacetime luxury. Sometimes the only rational hedge against total loss is to dilute yourself, to accept the violence done to coherence in order to preserve any future. At dawn, the 2 cells shook hands without ceremony and walked in opposite directions across a white basin already scarred by old shell holes. None of them would see the others again. That afternoon, a runner arrived at the now half-manned camp with a strip of paper from Tito's HQ, instructing a relocation to a new rendezvous. But the courier refused to say who gave him the order, and he demanded 2 sovereigns before speaking another word. The men stared at him in the doorway, unsure whether he carried deliverance, deception, or bait in German service. They paid him anyway. When the war ended, paper spoke louder than witnesses. Nothing from Cell A, the coastal-bound trio, ever surfaced in Allied or partisan files. No burial reports, no POW intake cards, no German after-action mention, no post-war repatriation list. They did not die in the historical record. They simply stopped existing inside it. The stay-behind cell lasted into March. They were thinner now, slower, coughing blood, and bargaining daily with people who were also bargaining to survive. Rumors traveled faster than boots. One villager swore Cell A had been seized by Chetniks and exchanged to the Germans near Konjic for an amnesty on rail sabotage. Another said partisans executed them for price-seeking diplomacy after discovering Allied gold in their lining. The contradiction was not noise. It was the truth condition of that front. Multiple realities could be simultaneously plausible because none were provable. The OSS later scraped archives from Berlin and Belgrade for reference. The German side yielded nothing but a vague sentence in a core diary about foreign agents rumored among bandits. The partisan side yielded silence. Deliberate or ignorant, no one knows. A British intelligence resume drafted in 1946 captured the brutality of uncertainty. Absence of evidence is not evidence of mercy. In a regular war, disappearance is not an anomaly. It is a modality. In all later proxy and paramilitary theaters, Greece 48, denied areas 50 to 60s, Laos, Angola, the lesson from Yugoslavia echoed. You can deploy elite men into a market of overlapping wars, but you may never retrieve either them or the truth of what happened to them. Missing is not a clerical status. It is a strategic cost. Some losses compound in 2 ledgers, the men themselves, and the knowledge locked forever behind their last decision. By the summer of 1945, OSS case officers closed the file with language colder than any grave, disposition unknown, no bodies, no return, no adjudication. Just a terminal accounting entry in a war fought partly with ledgers. After VE Day, the OSS men who lived had to narrate what the dead could not. The after-action memoranda that crossed from Bari to Washington tried to explain a disappearance without explanation, a rare honesty in war files. The conclusion, written without flourish, was that the mission's center of gravity failed not from German fire but from mispricing trust in a market of violence. The men who survived the winter in Bosnia returned home to a life whose clock still ran forward. Theirs had frozen for months at the tempo of rumor, barter, and fear. One of them, interviewed privately in 1947, said of the vanished cell, "They were not betrayed once. They were auctioned." He meant that there was no singular treason to punish, only a chain of rational self-interest in a starving country where gold and survival were entwined. In London, a Foreign Office analyst argued that the Allies had acted as if money could stand in for positional advantage, when in fact it became the positional disadvantage, advertising value to every actor with both eyes open. A closing OSS digest, circulated years later at the birth of CIA, framed a rule that would govern a generation of covert work. Funds can accelerate a decision, but cannot determine its direction. In Yugoslavia, money bought kinetics, sabotage, couriers, introductions, but not the persistence of any allegiance once the marginal price changed. From later cash-denominated wars, cash for police in Baghdad precincts, cash for informants in Helmand, the same signal recurs. Capital imports compliance, not conviction. The delta between the two is where men go missing. The older meaning of wealth, not abundance but margin of freedom, was inverted here. The goal that was meant to give the agents room to maneuver instead narrowed it until they were tradable. No cross recovered, no grave marked, no name amended from unknown. The lost agents of occupied Yugoslavia did not fail tactically. They failed in a way more final. They vanished into the equilibrium of a civil war whose logic was price, not oath.